everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Before we start, I wanted to mention that Catholic Culture has just started its annual spring fundraising campaign. And this is the campaign that will allow us to keep going through the rest of the year, keep bringing you all these podcasts and all the resources on our website. Our goal for this campaign is to raise $60,000. We're totally running on donations, as many of you already know, so we can't keep going without your support. Any little bit helps. Of course, if you want to sign up for a monthly pledge, that's great as well, or a one-time donation. We do pray for our benefactors and all of our listeners every day. So we appreciate anything you can give. You can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio for that. Thank you very much for that. And today we're going to be talking about, you could say, the theology of hiking. My guest, Father John Nepil, is a priest of the Archdiocese of Denver and vice rector and professor of theology at St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver. And he is quite the mountaineer and has written a new book from Ignatius Press, To Heights and Unto Depths, Letters from the Colorado Trail. Father, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Thomas. Good to be with you.
Well, maybe you could just start by, if you don't mind, just introducing the basic structure of this book, because it's kind of a mix of a, travel account and philosophical meditation at each stage of the journey.
Yeah, certainly. So this book's been a long time coming. I'm 41 years old, grew up in Colorado, was ordained, kind of had a dramatic conversion back to the faith right before my 18th birthday. And then went to seminary shortly thereafter, was ordained a priest at 27. The reason I say all that is because growing up in Colorado, I had a deep love of the backcountry and hiking and climbing, but did not have faith in God, even though I was raised Catholic, and actually started to reject that. So one of the questions that I have always thought about is, why was that the case? Why was I not encountering God in creation? What was the kind of worldview that was at play, the presuppositions that were keeping me from that? And then how did the transformation into the life of Christian faith really elevate and kind of resituate the whole reality of creation, where it became something that was a monstrance of God's presence and a revelation of his mystery, a call to relationship with him. So that's the kind of backstory. When I was 27, I was a chaplain at the University of Colorado in Boulder. So it became time to kind of communicate and carry this onto the trail as a young spiritual father. And that's where a lot of these stories came to be. The immediate creation of the book was a through hike on the Colorado Trail in the summer of 2022. The Colorado Trail is 486 miles. It runs from southwest of Denver to Durango, Colorado, which is almost Utah, right through the Rockies. And we did it in one go. And the book was occasioned by that trip, but also the desire to articulate and communicate how the Catholic worldview centered on the incarnation pulls together these themes of creation, humanity, and God, and how kind of we can rebuild those worldviews by immersing ourselves in God's creation. And so that was the book. The frame and the actual structure of the book, to answer your question specifically, your long answer, is Hilaire Belloc's book, A Path to Rome, which is this great travel narrative of his direct walk to the city of Rome through the Alps, combined with Romano Guardini's book, Letters from Lake Como. So I kind of took the epistolary style of Guardini and the narrative of Belloc and tried to kind of weave them together. So each letter from the trail is the story of the trail and different kind of stories from 14ers and different adventures, but then it's unpacking one specific aspect of our incarnational worldview as Catholics.
Great. Yeah, well, that's interesting to hear about the literary background, because I haven't read those books you referenced, so I wouldn't have necessarily picked up on that, although you do quote from Guardini in there for sure. Mm-hmm. You used the word creation a bunch of times there, and I am curious. Well, I have a cousin who is also a big hiker, and he has talked about sort of the the hiking scene, and kind of worldviews that you find there, and a lot of big potheads and stuff like that. And I'm just sort of curious: was there also an evangelical aspect to writing this book? Are you hoping that this book may find its way to people who are not Catholic, who are really big into mountaineering and such, and kind of get them to recalibrate their perspective on this thing that they love and have it lead them to God?
100%. Yeah, this book is not it's not like anything I've read. It's just a very different kind of book where it's high level theology and metaphysics. It's the real deal. I mean, you got to grapple with some serious thought here. We have such a robust tradition that we've been given,
Right.
and I'm pulling from five main thinkers that are serious, trying to present them as kind of clearly as possible. Um, but I do hope that this gets in the hands of people who are far from the church, but who love the backcountry, and this can kind of reopen things, begin conversations. That really is a big part of it. I did make the decision fundamentally early on to be like, I'm a Catholic priest. I'm not going to try and
Right.
water down language so that it'll be more attractive. It's just like this is who I am. This is who we are. But there's a kind of openness and a breadth to it that hopefully people will find engaging.
Now, in your experience hiking with these groups of people, um, is that mostly with other Catholics? Have you gone on long trips in your time as a priest, let's say, with non-Catholics, or sort of had encounters with obviously you've had encounters with non-Catholics on the trail, but what I mean is encounters that kind of turned into um, an opportunity for a longer term relationship of evangelization or anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. I would say about 20% of the people that I'm on the trail with are usually not Catholic or fallen away Catholics. And that I love that. I mean, it gives access. It kind of, a lot of times people are not comfortable talking to priests. So like I'm doing a wedding this summer from a guy who was invited on a backcountry ski trip 3 years ago. He and his girlfriend, they're living together. He's a fallen away Catholic. She's kind of a Methodist or whatever. And through a series of events, she just became Catholic, and they've been in RCA, or they've been in marriage prep with me, and they're getting married in the church. And it really kind of came together. But that all started from just backcountry skiing together. And then the questions started to emerge. So I think from the perspective of an evangelical pedagogy, it's really effective when you kind of get outside, when you share that love. It's not for everybody, but when you share that, it's a great way to interact and meet people that disarms them, and it doesn't freak them out that they're talking to a priest right now.
Okay, great. So when talking to non-Catholics who are really into this life of going up and doing these intense long hikes and mountain climbs, um, what in your experience is the philosophy that they bring to this activity? How do they kind of find meaning in it, if they do at all? What lens are they looking at this through?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that there's a number of levels to it. I think that on a natural level, when you immerse yourself in the wilderness, like in creation deeply, you recover aspects of your humanity that kind of drone out in the urban technologized world. So when you're sitting in a valley at the end of the day and you've been hiking all day, there's no phone, there's no Wi-Fi, it's just silence. Like something reawakens in you, just humanly. I think that this is how people lived in the country, in the peasant world of my grandparents prior to the kind of urbanization and then the suburbanization of the world, which is what the majority of us kind of find ourselves in some way or the other. And so there's a recovery, there's like a retrieval of that, which I think just resonates with people on a deep level. I think that's one thing. I think that then there are these moments of unbelievable beauty and grandeur and transcendence that I would call it the noumenal experience. Is it spiritual? Yes. Is it religious? Yeah, in a way. Uh, but it's just this kind of baseline awe that presents itself when alpenglow hits the mountains a certain way, or the ocean that you're out in is calm, or whatever it might be. Just the kind of vastness of the creaturely realm. So that's kind of positive things. But I think a lot of it is the ego and escapism. At least it was for me. On a negative way, it's I want to do awesome things so that I can prove to other people my awesomeness. Not everybody has fallen into this, but there was a latent selfishness and a kind of consumerism that played into my pursuit of climbing mountains and doing all the things. And this is all before cell phones and Strava, and we had real cameras that we carried and
Wait,
books
what's
with.
what's Strava?
Strava is an online platform for outdoor people, biking,
Okay, okay,
running. It's like the old millennial social media. It's
gotcha.
all
Okay,
active people. Um, you don't
cool.
need it. I
All
don't
right.
need it, and I still have it. But I think that's a lot of it. And then there's an escape too. I talk in the book about kind of the cutthroat pressurization of my adolescent life, academics, athletics, social. It was just like I would go to the mountains and to escape from the intensity of things, but that became an escape, and then that oftentimes gets paired with psychotropic drugs because it's part of the escape. And that was for me the case. So all of these things kind of play in to make it for a very complex but ultimately unfulfilling experience over the long haul. And people are looking for something deeper. And Christ offers that in the incarnation when God becomes man and actually enters into creation. And that's what we have to offer.
Mm. Psychotropic drugs, well, being on a mountaintop seems dangerous. I don't know. Do people just fall off sometimes?
Dude,
Uh,
totally. I
uh,
tell a story about getting on top of a peak in the book called Snowmass Peak. And the last guy that had been on the top of the mountain right before we got there had fallen off on his descent and died. So uh, kind of an eerie feeling, like you're the next living people on top of this peak. And there's another group that arrived at the same time. Um, I'm vesting for mass, saying mass on top of the mountain. So I just go over to the guy and I'm just like, "Hey, just so you know, we're gonna say mass over here, and you're welcome to join us." And he said, "Thank you. Just so you know, we're gonna smoke weed over here. You're welcome to join us." And we kind of laughed and went our own ways. But the point I make in the book
uh,
is that we're all dealing with the question of death here. We're all dealing with finality and massive risk, which is the last guy that stood on this mountain died. He fell off a cliff descending the mountain that we're about to descend. So, how do we deal with
wow.
that?
Wow.
Prayer, escape, and drugs. I mean, that's the kind of contrast.
Okay, so who was it who said because it's there as a
That
reason to climb
was
mountains?
that was. Oh no, I'm spacing.
Famous line.
Not Edmund Hillary.
Yeah, it was somebody else.
It's not Gregory. Um, George
Well,
Mallory.
okay.
George
So
Mallory. Yeah.
what do you make of that?
So in the book, I kind of compare Mallory's because it's there as kind of the modern framework, the modern worldview of like it's there and we need to conquer it because that's what we do. We live in this kind of Baconian notion of relating to nature as something that we can conquer and manipulate for our own purposes, and that includes the heights. So because it's there. I kind of play on that a bit metaphysically. It's there, like it speaks to us. Mount Everest exists. It's unbelievable. It doesn't have to exist, but Mallory's thing is like because it exists, we have to conquer it. And then I contrast that 30 years later with Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to actually summit and descend. Mallory might have summited, but he died. All we know is he died on the mountain. Sir Edmund Hillary's great line was, "It's not the mountains that we conquer, but ourselves." So this kind of notion of self-conquest, which is a bit more attuned to the Christian idea, I think not there yet, but certainly an element. Versus Mallory, it's just a very much so kind of command and conquer nature. That's what we do. Um, so I take that, break that down, but then also kind of put a different spin on it because it's there. Speaking of just metaphysical wonder, so the very
Hmm.
foundations of why we do philosophy, why we think
Right.
about how we contemplate anything, it's just there. It's amazing and it's
Right.
good.
Right. Right.
beautiful. So
Right. Yeah. Um, well, okay. So you were talking about, this guy falling off the mountain and dying. And obviously, we live in a very risk averse society in many ways. There's this, this phrase like safetyism became current a few years ago, I think maybe
hmm
during COVID
hmm
or something like that. Um, and yet, I mean, there's obviously aspects of that to be critiqued. And yet, there are obviously like moral calculations to be made with regard to like, okay, what is worth risking my life for?
hmm
And so, what kind of thought process do you have about um, the fact that sometimes you are risking your life in making these climbs? It might not be like approximate risk, but you never know when conditions could arise that could turn it into approximate risk. So, how do you kind of think about um, doing something that I suppose to some people may be a necessity in a certain sense, but in the strict sense is kind of like a gratuitous activity. You're not going up there to, you know, um, get the mystical stone that's going to save the world, or get food for your family, or whatever. It's
hmm
it's it's you're doing it because it's worthwhile in itself. So how do you think about that in terms of like what level of risk is acceptable and things like that, and kind of how that calculation is made?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, as you said earlier, I think that safetyism was connected to the book Coddling of the American Mind, and how there's a whole
Okay.
generation of Gen X parents who have basically tried to eliminate all risk, and what they've created is kind of the most fragile generation in history, just cannot function.
Right.
So risk is interesting because risk is like puts the body and it puts the soul in tension, uh, in a way that actually creates its health. So we know from the body that if the body is not held under tension, if there's not some kind of activity, exercise, the body atrophies. But the risk always of doing something, of putting it into that position, is what goes against this kind of safetyism. Okay, to your question, why do we go to the mountains and what are these risks? Well, there are risks. There's major risks, but I actually think it's much more. There's 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 a kind of contingency in the mountains that is wild, and uncontrollable, such as changing weather patterns, all kinds of things like that. And then there's also something that's very fixed, which is I'm going to get on this trail and I know exactly where I'm going. I have the map, I have the route, I know it. And that's different than when I get in my car and drive to this high school where I have to say mass after this, where I could get hit by a drunk driver. I could run into a pedestrian who crosses at the wrong time. Like there's a kind of contingency in modern urban world that I actually find way crazier and way more unpredictable than being in the backcountry, even though there is that kind of precariousness. So ultimately, the virtue of prudence, which is kind of governed over by the gift of wisdom, is something we pray for. I talk about mistakes I've made, but I always go with guys. I'm always with other people, many of times who are more experienced and more prudential than I am, and we don't take a lot of risks. The riskiest thing we do is backcountry skiing, and we play that very safe. So I just did a ski trip, took 6 days. We skied from the town of Aspen to Vail, with 11 guys. But we studied that for months. We watched weather conditions, avalanche danger. We had all the kind of precautionary things in order, and we executed a very safe trip. But it's a lot of work, um, to do that. So yeah, if you're passionate about it, and you're not reckless, you embrace the risk, but you always are kind of assessing those things and doing that together with a group that you trust, experienced outdoorsmen who have leadership skills. Then you know you never know, but you're usually able to give God glory through what you're doing.
When you say the modern risks are crazier, is that because they're more kind of instantaneous and there's less that you can sort of do prudentially to respond to them, being hit by a car or something like that?
I think so. I mean, yeah, just modern mobility is the a level of risk involved in just the creation of the automobile, like just crazy to think about that. And versus when I'm hiking on a trail in a mountain valley and I know the weather patterns because I've been here before, I have a lot of time to kind of watch this thing and make a decision. The
Mm.
challenge that I face is I'm going to want to go to that summit. So I already have to, if I haven't surrendered, that's the difference, right? Is like I could get hit by a car walking out of the street here. I can't control that. What I can control is here come the clouds, but I got to get to that summit and I'm so close. That's usually how the story starts when people die or get in trouble. And that's usually how the story's gone when I've gotten in trouble. So it's
Mm.
about that kind of detaching the summit, which is going to be something that the
Mm.
city doesn't have that kind of end, so to speak.
I see. Um, Now, I guess you don't stop being a priest when you go on these hikes. You're saying mass and everything, saying your divine office, I'm sure.
Mhm.
But and how do you fit these hikes in with your sort of normal duties? Like, how frequently are you going out, and are you're just taking your time off and using it that way, or how does that kind of all fit together?
Yeah, so I kind of see this as it's not really vacation, it's kind of ministry, but technically I guess it gets docked as vacation days. I really don't like how we calculate priestly life with like days off and vacation. It's like
Uh huh.
if this is paternity, spiritual paternity, then what are we doing? So I usually spend these times with people, with
Right.
young
Right.
people,
Yeah, that seems like a big
and
factor. Yeah.
every once in a while, it'll be just a buddy and I will go do something, but like that it is kind of in I wouldn't call it time off the parish, but it counts for that. We have a certain number of days that we get, and I use that to take these trips. And some of it is like just community. I just was inspired by what John Paul did. So like
Mm, yeah.
14 years ago, I started doing a hut trip over New Year's. They're way up in the mountains, and we ski up to them. And that started with college kids who are now all married, and I've done all their weddings and baptize their babies, and but we still go up and spend a few days together skiing, and that for me is that technically parish ministry? No, but is that priesthood? That's priesthood in its essence, right there. And mass, of course, in the office and everything.
So you're in this kind of lineage of, famous Catholic hikers, right? St. John Paul II, Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, and you mentioned, and this delighted me, that Pius XI was this known mountaineer during his time as a priest. I thought that was awesome. I'm a big fan of him and his encyclical on marriage in particular. And so that was Akil Radi
Yeah,
was his name. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting to find out. And even wrote a book on the subject, which was translated into English at the time in the 20s or whenever that was. Um, One thing I was wondering when thinking about that was like, how far back does this activity goes? People have been climbing mountains forever, but how far back does like recreational mountain climbing go?
yeah,
As opposed to like I'm going
yeah.
to my villa where we have gardens and a vineyard, to
hmm
retreat from the busyness of Rome or whatever, something like that.
I would date recreational outdoors outdoor activities to the town of Chamonix in France in the 1780s.
Okay.
They climb Mount Blanc and they kind of create it becomes the first kind of resort
Oh,
in
okay.
Switzerland, France. And that's when it becomes kind of climbing for climbing's sake. So down the street from Chamonix, it's late 18th century. You've got peasants who are working the land below the Matterhorn. No one's climbed it yet, and they're just trying to survive, right? This is where they've lived for centuries.
Right.
Beautiful farmland, the hillside. This is a lot of Switzerland is very poor, um, and then the emergence of the kind of resort, and then tourism really began. I mean, Nietzsche hammers against tourists in his aphorisms, which is this like 1880s. So there's already a sense of like the touristic culture is something that is kind of connected to the bourgeois modern kind of world that emerges 18th, 19th century. And all of a sudden, this kind of climbing phenomenon starts of like, we should go to the heights. We're not just doing it for religious purposes, um, or we're not doing it for kind of survival reasons. We're just doing it for enjoyment. Um, I think that people have always climbed mountains in some way with all of those in mind, but the kind of secularized REI world,
Mm,
that's I put the roots there. And I think the architects in the United States who kind of developed this were the transcendentalists. So I talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, who is a student of theirs a little later.
right.
But they
Yeah.
kind of start to lay out this kind of nature for nature's sake. And it's eclipsed. What's eclipsed is the idea of creation. So there's no one's talking about creation more now. It's just nature, which is this kind of autonomous, self-subsisting thing that we can go and appreciate and enjoy, but it's not relational in any way. It doesn't speak of God. And that's kind of the world of the transcendentalist that then gets secularized. And I kind of trace that a little bit in the book.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned is this vague sense of gratitude that people reference, but without any like object for the gratitude. Like there's no definite being that they're thanking. This is something I've observed in the past, being in the artistic world. Sometimes you see the same similar thing. I'm so grateful. I'm just so grateful for the music and wherever it
Hmm.
comes from, that
Hmm.
kind of thing. And so can there even be gratitude, without any particular person to be grateful to?
Yeah, yeah, the can't, not really. I mean, I'm not grateful to this LaCroix right now for existing. I'm
Right.
just so grateful for you. I'm so inspired by your naturally essence that's pamplemousse, which I think is grapefruit. Like that's not a human experience. Like if you gave me this and I said, "Oh, thank you, Thomas, I appreciate that. I was thirsty." Then it's great. So gratitude is relational. It speaks of an ontology. It's a gift structure to reality. So I think it's the hollowing out of a metaphysical and theological framework which for centuries was built in and has just been secularized and flattened. So people say that I'm just grateful, but um, it's empty now. You're really not grateful. Yeah, you can't be.
Yeah. So given the modern origins of this particular kind of mountain climbing, do you see yourself as kind of re-Catholicizing this activity, which is kind of essentially modern and yet kind of has connections to more ancient approaches to creation?
Yeah, I'm trying to engage the REI culture, so recreational, touristic approaches to the outdoors. So touristic would be like, let's build highways through every national park so that we can bring our trailer homes through all summer long, which is what we
Hmm.
do. That's touristic. That's insufficient. Um, so fine, they're doing that fine, but that really speaks to me of kind of I just want to consume all the best parts of the park without doing any work. The people who get out and who kind of recreate, who get on the trail, I have more respect for that, but still not enough because it's a secular endeavor. And I think what we're trying to do is we're not just trying to baptize recreational or touristic activities that are modern and largely secular. What we're trying to do is to say those are insufficient, but they're desires of modern man to do what we've always done, which is to contemplate the mystery of God
Hmm.
in the created realm. There's something for me about through hiking in particular and climbing mountains that expresses that kind of contemplative ethos that I want to bring to creation, which is receptivity. It's Mary's fiat. It changes the way that I think about perspective of my life. It also helps me to ground the Catholic faith and free it from all the kind of ideological frameworks that kind of float when we get away from our humanity. It's hard to live humanity now
Hmm.
in a technological age, even as Catholics. So something that I gained from that. So it's about critiquing that, but I wouldn't say we're not baptizing REI. We're just saying that that's kind of an offshoot, and that happened, but there's something deeper at work, and we need to reclaim that. I would say.
let's talk about this notion of the wilderness. Christianity has from the beginning seen this profound significance in creation, which is the word that you've been using. Um, and not only this significance and that it's the creation of God, but even like looking to find specific symbolism in particular animals and plants and things like that. That's a big part of our tradition, especially in the Middle Ages. Something that has been largely lost even among Catholics. That particular aspect, sort of allegorical, I guess you could call it, and that's the approach to creation, or what modern people would call nature. But then there's also the wilderness specifically, which is a particular kind of place, right? It's the uncultivated land. It's the place where nobody is. It's the place where the wild animals are. It's potentially dangerous. And it's the place where I guess there are bandits lurking out there and stuff like that in the ancient world. I'm thinking about, when I think about like, okay, what has been the relationship between Christians and the wilderness? I guess you could think of like a John the Baptist, right? You could think of the Desert Fathers going out there, and the Desert Fathers are going there to escape the sinfulness of the cities and the kind of, like, I guess you could say in some ways the mediocrity of like the bourgeois Christianity at a time when Christianity was becoming more socially acceptable and more people were converting, and you didn't have to be sort of hardcore to be a Christian anymore because you weren't necessarily risking martyrdom just merely by being a Christian, all that kind of stuff. So they're going out there. Then on the other hand, if you read, like St. Athanasius's life of St. Anthony, the wilderness is where he goes out and he does battle with the demons. The demons are lurking out there. It's sort of unbaptized territory in a way. And so there's this kind of, the cities are, that the pagans are the ones who are out in the countryside still, right? And the the heathens, right? And then the Christians are the ones who are in the cities. And so there's this kind of, you go out there and you go out there to escape, worldliness, but then there's also the aspect of, that is the place that has not been sort of necessarily claimed for Christ yet, because that's not where the churches are. That's not where the sacraments are happening. And so I'm just curious. I mean, it's kind of a vague thing to bring up, but I'm just curious what you think about all that, and not so much creation, but specifically the wilderness, kind of how to think about that in a Christian way. And is the wilderness the kind of the apex of where we find God in creation necessarily? I mean, the question arises to me also is like, this recreational hiking arising when it does, is it possible that like, just a hike in the countryside in the farmland isn't good enough anymore because we've got this like industrialized farming, and the sort of the regions of creation closer to the cities is now no longer so much imaging God for people, and so they have to go further out to find that. I'm just curious of what the dynamic is in seeking the wilderness and the sort of the overgrown places in particular.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a fantastic question, and you bounced it to me, but when we were corresponding by email, you're the first. I've done a lot of podcasts, and you're the first person to ask it, so I'm thrilled to
Nice.
have a conversation about it. I'll start with a couple thoughts, and then we can kind of go deeper into it, because I think there's a lot of nuancing and clarification. You already kind of set up the basic framework. So man exists and is born in the garden. He's not born in the wilderness. He's cast out into the wilderness in after the fall in Genesis chapter 4. So we have to just start with that we're made for a cultivated world of communion and intimacy with God. Now, if we take evolution seriously, this is a world that would have been harsh if you put it 80,000 years ago, whatever you want to say. Like this is a very precarious landscape. This is not me going on a hike 30 minutes from Denver where I might run into a mountain lion, but I have my Garmin reach so the helicopter can fly in and save me or something like that. Like this is a world of absolute precariousness that we don't understand. So when they talk about garden and safety, they mean it. They understand this. That's Genesis really communicates that. So the being cast out into the wilderness, which gets translated into the Greek as eremos, right, as the wilderness or the desert, they're kind of synonymous, has kind of a fundamentally, at first, negative connotation, as you said. This is not a good place. This is a place of alienation from God, spiritual destitution. Um, but then something interesting happens with the Exodus is that they actually are called out of the cultivated pagan world of Egypt and into the wilderness. So the call is into the wilderness. So there's kind of like different moments when wilderness means something different, and then the tradition is going to kind of play into that. Ultimately, they're not made for the wilderness for wandering, but they're made for the cultivated garden, which is Israel. All right. The prophets will then go back and forth into the desert. There's desert places within Israel itself, but Jerusalem comes to see itself as kind of the eternal city, as the garden. Okay, so that's the biblical backdrop. Mary flees into the wilderness at the end of time to escape from the devil. So, all that being said, we have a very, very complicated idea of wilderness. It's not just evil, and it's not just the absence of God. Uh, we have to speak of it in different ways. Think of it like analogously speaking of the world. So St. John talks about the world, the sin comes to the world, the flesh, and the devil. What he means here is the lapsarian world, the fallen world. He doesn't mean cosmos, he doesn't mean creation, but sometimes he speaks of world as creation. So I'd like to kind of say that we can speak in different ways about eremos, about the wilderness, and they interpenetrate each other. So eremos is where we get the word hermitage. So there's a positive portrayal of going into the wilderness for this kind of eremitical lifestyle, which is not just I go in there, as you said, well, I don't just go there to find Satan who's in the wilderness. There is a spiritual battle that unfolds, but I also am going to escape the kind of bourgeois, intra-worldly uh, city life of the ancient world. And then again, what happens? Well, I think that the beauty of kind of the medieval world is this interplay between the gardens and the cultivated land of the monasteries, but also engaging the wilderness. And the saints are oftentimes doing this. And so you go to places like Switzerland where you have these unbelievable peaks, and you have people like Bernard of Monjou climbing them. But then you have these cultivated farms in the summer. So they kind of interpenetrate each other. I think that's the mystery of Christendom caught that. Okay,
Well,
fast forward.
it's
Yeah,
interesting you mentioned the medieval ages because I was just thinking, okay, Saint Francis also went up on the mountainside, but that feels like a very different experience than what Saint Anthony had. And maybe it's just
right.
the difference between the mountainside of Assisi, and I've been up there. Perhaps you have too, to the
Yeah,
Hermitage. Um, Perhaps it's partly just the difference between the relatively friendly climb, there and the desert in Egypt or whatever. That is, it feels like a much more hostile environment. I don't know. Um,
yeah. I mean, Francis, I think, and the mendicant movement is. It needs to be understood as a movement like the Desert Fathers, which was
right.
the birth of monasticism, was from the Desert Fathers. I mean, unprecedented. Did it for very historical, very specific reasons. Same with the mendicants, but I think you're right to say that there was a kind of spiritual warfare that you see in the Desert Fathers, and when you see the first mendicant movements, that they're just immersing themselves in the wilderness, but there's not a sense of anything. I think that's part of this is the
Yeah,
radical
there is
poverty.
spiritual warfare, but Francis, it's very explicitly like he loves being up there with the birds and everything.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
not something that I remember ever hearing about with the Desert Fathers, that they were like sort of going out there to be at one with their fellow brother, sister animals or something like that.
yeah. Yeah, so I think that my own experience is Francis is the patron saint of my state in Colorado, so he's always been somebody that we've kind of looked to. Franciscans were the first ones here in the late 1600s in the south. They came from New Spain, Mexico. The names of our mountains are Spanish from that. So there was a Franciscan spirit that kind of came in here. So I think that maybe as I speak about wilderness, it's going to be more akin to and attuned with that. The last thing I'll say on wilderness, and then I promise I'll stop because this is getting really long. I go on this, but in the mystical tradition of the last few centuries, in particular, um, you start to see the wildness of God's transcendence expressed by this idea that there's something in there, that God's ineffability, the apophatic, as we would call it, the negative, that God is beyond, that
Hmm.
the wild places, they speak of that. So I see the cultivation of gardens, like you go to England, for example, maybe you have this in New York City, but you have these beautiful gardens. That speaks of the immanence of God's mystery and beauty, but the wildness and the expansiveness of the heights, especially, they speak of the apophatic, that which is beyond. So encountering God's infinity and omnipotence, which is the apophatic way, the negative way, that seems to be the way that a lot of these kind of, again, spiritual writers will speak about the wilderness, which is God's love. And that's, I have a chapter that kind of concludes the book on that. Strictly speaking, that might be the best way to describe it.
So
All the
there is a
while
kind of a
presuming the
development,
opens.
and there's a development in Catholic spirituality that allows another aspect of this relationship with the wilderness to emerge.
I think so. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow, that's fascinating. And I guess another angle of this is not so much the question of whether it's God or the devil out there in the wilderness, but the question of the goodness of humanity itself, right? Because there's this idea that like untouched nature is better because
Mm.
humanity just kind of interferes with this nature, which exists separately from us and really could do without us. And so if you want to find nature in its sort of purest form, you have to go out where human beings have affected it the least,
Hmm.
as opposed to like nature in its purest form was intended for the dominion of man and the cultivation and everything like that, which you referred to earlier. So there is a very modern, I guess that's a romantic, or maybe it's post-romantic environmentalist. I don't know if they're exactly romantics necessarily, but there's that aspect of it too. This kind of like man is we have to go in there and leave it exactly as we found it, kind of thing. But of course, there's a difference between cultivating farmland and being in harmony with nature and just like leaving your litter and like
Yeah.
paving a road or whatever.
Yeah, and this pairs well with your whole project, Catholic culture. So, like, I love what you just said. It's like, it's very Rousseauian. It is romantic, but it's really Rousseau who's like, evil is in humanity, evil is in civilization. You go to the pristine places in order to find. That's where the noble savage is, left to himself. But
Right.
it's this whole Christian culture thing, which is fundamentally false, and we reject that. The purpose, what humans do is we take nature and we cultivate it. That's what culture is. Like, is that we are able to express the kind of innately symbolic ways that we think about reality on a deep metaphysical level. That's what we use in creation, and nature is not left to itself. It's not this kind of autonomous subsisting thing. So the purpose of faith in encountering nature is to create culture. It's not
Mm.
the opposed to that. So this book is really not about like a Rousseauian kind of resurgence. And it's interesting how people, and you might hear more on this with your work, but people always, you know, rightfully dog on cultural Catholicism. But
Mm-hmm.
I do always push back and say, but we can't not make culture. Like
Mm.
we have to have culture. And Christopher Dawson's so good on this. And so is Guardini about nature and culture, these kind of things. And you see that in the cultivated landscape around the Alps in northern Italy. At least that's where I first encountered it in Switzerland, even though it's very secular now. But that came out of this natural sense of how Catholic faith expresses itself and elevates nature, especially in culture, liturgical
Mm.
culture in particular.
Fascinating. Well, people can read the book again, To Heights and Unto Depths, Letters from the Colorado Trail, and that has a lot more philosophical and theological reflection in it, and also a lot of great anecdotes, some of which are quite entertaining. The one with the moose, for instance. So I'll leave that for people to discover if they get the book. It also has a foreword by Archbishop Chaput, which is very nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, Father John, thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
Thanks, Tom. It's good to be with you. God bless you.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.